There is a moment in the Invincible comics somewhere around issue 140, where Mark Grayson is inside the sun. Not near it, inside it. His skin is charring off his body in real time, his arms are broken, and the only reason he is still alive is because he refuses to let go of the throat of the most dangerous being in the universe. That is how you kill the strongest Viltrumite ever born. Not with a weapon, not with a plan. You kill him with your teeth, while the surface of a star melts you down to nothing. And somehow, the man holding on is not even the most interesting part of that story. Because to understand why that fight matters, you need to understand every single Viltrumite who came before it. You need to understand the full spectrum of power that this species represents, from the weakest hybrid who could barely survive a punch, to the Grand Regent who could crush a planet with his bare hands. And that is exactly what we are going to do tonight, one Viltrumite at a time, from the bottom of the list all the way to the very top. If that sounds like the kind of thing you want to drift off to, you should know that subscribing to the channel genuinely helps us keep making these long videos. It is completely free and it makes a real difference for us. So, the Viltrumites. Before we start ranking individual members of this species, you need a foundation. You need to understand what a Viltrumite actually is. Not just the surface level stuff, not just the strong and they can fly version. The real mechanics, because the way Viltrumite biology works is the key to understanding why some of them are so much more powerful than others, and why a ranking like this is even possible in the first place. Viltrumites look human. That is the first thing you notice about them in the comics. Robert Kirkman made a deliberate choice there because the entire premise of Invincible is built on the idea that the most dangerous things in the universe look just like you. They walk among you, they live in your neighborhoods, they marry your people, and then one day, they put their fist through a mountain and you realize that the person you trusted was never what you thought they were. That dissonance, that gap between appearance and reality, is the engine that drives almost every major twist in the series. Viltrumites do not look like monsters. They look like your neighbor, your colleague, your father. And that is precisely what makes them terrifying. But beneath the human-looking exterior, Viltrumite bodies are fundamentally different. Their cellular structure is built around what the comics describe as smart atoms. These are atoms with variable properties that can be rearranged to produce different effects depending on what the body needs. When a Viltrumite punches something, those atoms align to maximize force output. When a Viltrumite gets hit, those same atoms rearrange to absorb and distribute impact. It is a kind of molecular adaptability that makes them, at the atomic level, the most versatile biological weapons in the universe. Their strength comes from the chemical bonds in their muscles being several thousand times stronger than the equivalent bonds in human muscle tissue. An adult Viltrumite can lift well over 100 tons, but that number is misleading because it only describes what a baseline adult Viltrumite can do. The strongest among them, the ones who have been alive for thousands of years, can do things that make 100 tons look quaint, punching through planets, surviving inside stars, fighting for days without rest across the surface of entire worlds. The upper end of Viltrumite power is not just superhuman, it is cosmic. And this strength is not fixed, it grows. Every Viltrumite gets stronger with age. Their physiology refines itself through a passive biological process, layering power on top of power as the centuries pass. A Viltrumite who has lived for 1,000 years is not just more experienced than one who has lived for 50. They are measurably, quantifiably stronger at the cellular level. Their atoms have been through more cycles of adaptation. Their muscles have been reinforced by more rounds of stress and recovery. Their durability has been tested by more impacts, more heat, more pressure, and each test has made them harder to break. This is the single most important factor in understanding Viltrumite power rankings. Age is not just a number for this species. It is a direct multiplier on every physical ability they possess. Additionally, Viltrumites can actively accelerate this process by repeatedly pushing their bodies to the absolute limit. By sustaining catastrophic damage and recovering from it, they force their biology to adapt faster. Each near-death experience triggers a rebuilding process that leaves them slightly stronger than before. This is why the most battle-scarred Viltrumites tend to be the most powerful. Every wound is a lesson their cells never forget. Every broken bone heals harder than it was before. The Viltrumite body treats damage the way a muscle treats exercise. It breaks down and it builds back stronger. Their flight works through a complex system involving their inner ear balance, the ability to generate inertia by mentally controlling their atoms, and the manipulation of gravitons. That inner ear mechanism is important because it is also their greatest vulnerability. Certain frequencies of sound can destabilize a Viltrumite's equilibrium, causing extreme pain, hallucinations, and in severe cases, unconsciousness or even coma. It is a tiny flaw in an otherwise nearly perfect biological design, and throughout the series, various characters exploit it to level a playing field that would otherwise be completely lopsided in the Viltrumite's favor. High-frequency sound weapons become one of the few reliable tools that non-superpowered forces can use against Viltrumites. And the Empire guards information about this vulnerability carefully. If every species in the galaxy knew about the ear weakness, the Empire's dominance would be significantly harder to maintain. They can survive in space. They can hold their breath for weeks, sometimes longer. They generate almost no fatigue toxins, which means they can fight at full power for extended periods without collapsing from exhaustion. When you see Viltrumites fight in the comics, these battles sometimes last for hours or even days. That is not artistic exaggeration. Their biology genuinely allows for sustained combat at planet-threatening levels of intensity over timeframes that would be impossible for any other species. Think about what that means in practical terms. 2 Viltrumites fighting each other at full power for 3 days straight. The collateral damage alone would render an entire continent uninhabitable, and they would not even be tired. And there is something else about that durability that deserves attention, because it connects to one of the most fascinating debates within the Viltrumite Empire itself. The question of purity. For most of their history, the Viltrumites believed that their power was tied to bloodline. Pure Viltrumite genetics produced the strongest warriors. Mixing with other species was, at best, a compromise, and at worst, a contamination. This belief was central to the Great Purge. It was central to the Empire's cultural identity. And for thousands of years, it went unchallenged, because the Viltrumites had never been forced to confront its logical conclusion. But here is the thing about genetic purity as a strategy. It works beautifully right up until the moment it does not. A species that eliminates variation in pursuit of uniformity gains short-term strength and long-term fragility. Every individual is powerful, yes, but they are all powerful in the same way. They share the same strengths, which means they share the same vulnerabilities. When the Scourge virus came, it did not need to outsmart the Viltrumites. It just needed to find one weakness that all of them shared. And because they had spent millennia eliminating genetic diversity, that weakness was universal. The virus threaded the needle of their shared biology and killed nearly all of them. Purity was not their salvation. It was their undoing. And the survivors, the fewer than 50 who remained, were forced to reckon with a truth that their entire civilization had been built to deny. They needed other species. Not as subjects, not as conquered populations, as partners, as parents, as the source of the genetic variation that might prevent the next extinction event. The irony is almost too perfect. The species that believed mixing was weakness was saved because mixing was the only path to survival. That tension between purity and hybridization runs through every character on this list. It shapes how they see themselves, how they see each other, and how they understand their place in the hierarchy. Keep it in mind, it matters more than you might think. Their healing factor allows them to regenerate from injuries that would be instantly fatal to any other species. Broken bones mend in days or weeks rather than months. Torn muscles regrow, organs repair themselves, even severed limbs can potentially be reattached or regrown given enough time and energy. But there is a hard limit. Catastrophic damage to the heart or brain can still kill them. If a Viltrumite loses their heart, the regeneration cascade fails because the heart is what drives the healing process. This specific vulnerability becomes the mechanism for several of the most significant deaths in the series, so keep it in mind as we go through the ranking. It matters. And their lifespan is measured not in decades, but in millennia. A healthy Viltrumite can live for thousands of years, getting stronger the entire time. Imagine a being that starts out capable of destroying a city and then has 5,000 years to compound that power. The oldest Viltrumites are not just old soldiers. They are forces of nature on a scale that most other species in the galaxy cannot comprehend. They have watched civilizations rise and fall. They have seen stars born and die. And through all of it, they have been getting stronger. Every century, every millennium, an unbroken upward curve of accumulating power. There is one more thing about Viltrumite biology that matters for this ranking, and it is perhaps the most consequential detail of all. Viltrumite DNA is dominant. When a Viltrumite has a child with a member of another species, the offspring inherits the Viltrumite abilities, not diluted, not weakened beyond recognition. The child gets the strength, the flight, the durability, the healing, the longevity. The extent to which these abilities manifest depends on the specifics of the other parent's genetics, and hybrids tend to be somewhat less powerful than pure-blooded Viltrumites. But the core power set transfers. This is enormously important for the ranking because it means that the Viltrumite power hierarchy includes beings who are not fully Viltrumite. Half-breeds, hybrids, children of mixed heritage who carry the strength of one parent's species in a body shaped by both. When you hear people debate Viltrumite power rankings online, one of the most common arguments is whether hybrids should be included at all. After all, if the ranking is about Viltrumite power, should someone who is only half Viltrumite qualify? The answer, at least for this video, is yes, because the comics treat them as Viltrumites, the Empire treats them as Viltrumites, and more importantly, their powers are Viltrumite powers. The biology is doing the same thing whether the person carrying it has 2 Viltrumite parents or 1. The scale might differ, but the nature of the ability is identical. There is also something to be said about the mustache. If you have spent any time with Invincible, either the comics or the show, you know that Viltrumite men tend to have impressive facial hair. Nolan has his iconic mustache. Thrag has his. Craig has his distinctive pencil variation. It is a recurring visual motif that Kirkman uses partly for humor and partly for identification. In the comics, the mustache becomes almost a signature of the species. You see a man with a certain kind of mustache in the Invincible universe, and your first thought is, that might be a Viltrumite. It is a small detail, but it is one that fans love, and it has become one of the most recognizable visual elements of the franchise. There is one final detail about Viltrumite physiology that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it ties directly into why some of the fights on this list play out the way they do. Viltrumite senses. Their hearing is enhanced well beyond human levels. Their vision operates across a broader spectrum. Their proprioception, the internal awareness of where their body is in space and how it is moving, is so refined that experienced Viltrumites can fight effectively in conditions of zero visibility. In the vacuum of space, where there is no sound and limited visual reference, a Viltrumite can still orient themselves, track an opponent's movement, and deliver precise strikes. This sensory suite is what allows their battles to span environments that would be completely disorienting to any other species. A fight that starts in a city, moves to the upper atmosphere, transitions into orbit, and then continues on the surface of a moon is not a chaotic series of random collisions for a Viltrumite. It is a continuous, coherent engagement. Their biology does not lose track of the fight just because the environment changes. If anything, the ability to move a fight across radically different environments is itself a combat tactic. A Viltrumite who is losing on the ground might drag the fight into space, or into a star, or through the core of a planet, knowing that the environmental shift might create an advantage that raw strength alone could not provide. Mark uses this exact tactic in the final fight of the series, and it works. That is the baseline. That is what every single Viltrumite is working with. And when you understand that foundation, you start to see why ranking them matters. Because even within a species where the weakest member can level a city block, the differences in power between the bottom and the top are astronomical. The weakest Viltrumite and the strongest Viltrumite are not playing the same game. They are not even in the same sport. Now, let us talk about where this species came from. Because the history of the Viltrumites is not just backstory. It is the explanation for why there are so few of them left, why they behave the way they do, and why every single Viltrumite on this list carries the weight of their species' choices on their shoulders. Viltrum was once just a planet, a civilization with culture, art, philosophy, disagreement. The inhabitants were powerful, yes, genetically gifted with abilities that most species could never dream of, but they were not yet the militaristic empire that would come to terrorize the galaxy. That transformation happened under one ruler, Emperor Argal, the first and most revered emperor in Viltrumite history. Under Argal's rule, Viltrum shifted from a civilization to a war machine. Other planets were conquered. Other species were subjugated or eradicated entirely. The Viltrumites came to see themselves not just as one civilization among many, but as the rightful rulers of everything they could reach. And under Argal, they had the power to enforce that belief. Entire worlds fell. Entire cultures were wiped from existence. The Viltrumite Empire grew until it spanned a significant portion of the galaxy. And at the center of it all sat Argal, the emperor who turned a species of individuals into a species of soldiers. Argal's reign is remembered as the Golden Age of Viltrum, and that detail reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the species. Their Golden Age was not a period of enlightenment or creativity or peace. It was the period when they were most effectively destroying everyone else. That is the cultural DNA that every Viltrumite on this list carries. Whether they embrace it or try to escape it, every Viltrumite was shaped by a civilization that believed the measure of greatness was how completely you could dominate everything around you. Then Argal was assassinated. A Viltrumite named Thetis, one of their own, a being we will discuss in great detail later in this video, decided that he could no longer participate in what his species was doing to the galaxy. He killed the Emperor in his private chambers, fled into the stars, and triggered a crisis that would reshape the Viltrumites forever. What followed was the Great Purge. Without their ruler, without the stabilizing force of Argol's absolute authority, the Viltrumites fractured. Power vacuums formed. Factions emerged. And the response from the surviving power structure was not reconciliation or reform. It was extermination. Every Viltrumite deemed weak, every member of the species deemed ideologically impure or insufficiently committed to the Empire's mission was hunted down and killed. Not by outsiders, by their own kind. Half the Viltrumite population was eliminated in a single, systematic campaign of internal genocide. The man who orchestrated this was Thrag. He rose to power in the blood-soaked aftermath of the Purge, establishing himself as Grand Regent and reforged the survivors into the most tightly controlled military force in the galaxy. The Viltrumites who emerged from the Great Purge were harder, colder, more unified, and more dangerous than ever before. But they were also fewer, much fewer. A species that once numbered in the millions was reduced to thousands. And then the Scourge virus came. Engineered by Thetis, who had spent the centuries since Argol's death building a resistance movement, the virus was specifically designed to attack Viltrumite biology. It targeted their immune systems, stripped away their superhuman strength and invulnerability, and killed them through hemorrhaging, organ failure, and physical wasting. The virus was devastatingly effective. It killed 99.9% of the remaining Viltrumite population. A species of thousands was reduced to fewer than 50 individuals. That is the context for everything that follows. Every Viltrumite you hear about tonight is a survivor of two extinction-level events, the Great Purge and the Scourge virus. They are the last of their kind. And that fact, that desperate scarcity, shapes every decision they make, every alliance they form, every fight they pick. When a species has fewer than 50 members, every single one of them matters. Every death is a step closer to total extinction, and every ranking becomes a question not just of who is strongest, but of who the species can afford to lose. Let us begin at the very bottom of the Viltrumite power hierarchy. We find not a warrior, but a child. A hybrid. A boy whose genetics were at war with themselves from the moment he was born, and whose short, painful life is one of the most heartbreaking stories Robert Kirkman ever wrote. His name is Oliver Grayson. Some people know him as Kid Omni-Man, and understanding his story requires understanding the planet where he was born. Thraxa is an alien world populated by insectoid beings with extraordinarily short lifespans. The Thraxans live for roughly 9 months. In that span, they are born, they mature, they form relationships, they have children, they grow old, and they die. An entire human lifetime compressed into less than a year. When Nolan Grayson fled Earth after his devastating confrontation with Mark in the first arc of the series, he ended up on Thraxa. And in that brief window of time, among the people who experienced every emotion with the intensity of beings who know they will be gone by next season, Nolan fell in love. Her name was Andressa, and she was Thraxan. Their relationship lasted by Nolan standards barely a blink, but it produced a child, Oliver. And Oliver, with his impossible genetics, half the strongest species in the galaxy and half a species that lives less than a year, became something no one was quite prepared for. Oliver inherited his father's Viltrumite DNA, which gave him the standard package of abilities: superhuman strength, flight, enhanced durability, speed that would make him one of the most powerful beings on most planets in the galaxy. But his Thraxan genetics introduced a complication that would define and ultimately shorten his entire life. He aged at an accelerated rate. Within a few Earth years, Oliver looked like a teenager. His body was constantly outpacing itself, developing muscle and bone and power faster than his mind could fully integrate. He was a child in an adolescent body with the potential of a demigod, and the emotional development of someone who had been alive for about 5 years. In terms of raw Viltrumite power, Oliver sits at the absolute bottom of this ranking, and that is not a criticism. It is simply a consequence of his genetics. His Thraxan side dilutes the Viltrumite biology enough to reduce his durability, his healing factor, and his overall power ceiling, compared to full-blooded Viltrumites. He is still devastatingly strong by the standards of almost any other species. Put him on a planet without Viltrumites and he would be the most powerful being there by an absurd margin. But within the hierarchy of his father's species, Oliver is fragile, breakable, vulnerable in ways that pure Viltrumites simply are not. There is also the question of what Oliver's accelerated aging means for his power ceiling. Viltrumite strength compounds over time. Centuries of living, fighting, recovering, and rebuilding produce exponential gains in physical capability. But Oliver does not have centuries. His Thraxan genetics compress his entire lifespan into a fraction of what a pure Viltrumite would experience. So while his body is Viltrumite enough to access the growth cycle, His clock is running so fast that the compounding never gets a chance to accumulate meaningfully. He is a savings account that earns the same interest rate as everyone else, but closes after 5 years instead of 5,000. The math simply does not work in his favor, and that is not a flaw he can train around or willpower his way past. It is baked into every cell of his body. The Thraxan half of him is a countdown timer that the Viltrumite half cannot override. In combat, this manifests as a kind of tragic almost. Oliver is fast enough to be dangerous, strong enough to hurt people who are not Viltrumites, durable enough to survive hits that would kill any human 1,000 times over. But within the hierarchy of his father's species, he is glass. He can dish out punishment that would level a city, and he can take punishment that would obliterate a military base, but the moment he faces someone in the upper tiers of Viltrumite power, the gap becomes a chasm. He simply has not had enough time alive for his biology to close that gap, and he never will. The clearest demonstration of this comes during the assault on Viltrum, when Thrag casually backhands Oliver hard enough to rip his jaw and arm off. A single, almost dismissive blow from the strongest Viltrumite, and Oliver is nearly killed. That is the gap between the bottom of this list and the top. A gap so vast that it barely registers as a fight. It registers as a gesture. But what makes Oliver genuinely fascinating, what makes him more than just a footnote in the power ranking, is his psychology. Growing up as the son of Omni-Man, absorbing Viltrumite values before his brother Mark's influence could fully counterbalance them, Oliver developed a ruthless streak that Mark never had. Where Mark would agonize over the morality of killing, spending entire issues wrestling with the ethics of lethal force, Oliver would simply act. A threat appeared, and Oliver neutralized it. No hand-wringing, no moral paralysis, just efficient, pragmatic violence. This created real tension between the brothers. Mark loved Oliver, protected him, wanted to be the kind of big brother who could guide him. But Mark also could not accept Oliver's willingness to cross lines that Mark had drawn for himself. The brothers argued about it, they fought about it, and neither one ever fully changed the other's mind because both of them were products of the same Viltrumite heritage expressing itself in different ways. Mark inherited the guilt, Oliver inherited the certainty, and neither one had the complete picture. In the end, Oliver's story resolves with a moment of such simple bravery that it transcends everything else about his character. In issue 141, Grand Regent Thrag comes for Mark's family. Thrag, the strongest Viltrumite in history, the being who sits at the absolute top of this ranking, arrives with the intention of killing Mark, Eve, and their daughter Tara. And Oliver, little Oliver, the weakest Viltrumite, the hybrid whose body was never built to withstand this kind of threat, steps between his family and the monster. He knows he cannot win. There is not a shred of uncertainty about the outcome. Thrag will kill him, and Oliver knows it, but he does it anyway. He stands in the gap because that is what love looks like when it has nothing else to offer. And Thrag drives his hand through Oliver's chest and kills him instantly. Oliver Grayson dies at the bottom of the power ranking and at the very top of something that rankings cannot measure. He dies for his brother, and that act, more than any feat of strength or speed, is what makes him worth remembering. So we start here, at the bottom, with a child who aged too fast and loved too fiercely and died because he had exactly enough courage to stand in a place where courage was the only weapon that mattered. There is something worth pausing on here before we move to the next tier, because Oliver's story raises a question that applies to every single being on this list, and it is a question the series never stops asking. What is power for? The Viltrumite Empire would say power exists to dominate, to control, to ensure that your will is imposed on the universe and no one can stop you. That is the philosophy that built the Empire. That is the philosophy that drove the Great Purge. And by that philosophy, Oliver is worthless. He is weak. He is a half-breed. He contributes nothing to the Empire's mission of universal domination. But by any other measure, Oliver's final act is one of the most powerful things that happens in the entire series. Not powerful in the sense of destroying cities or shattering planets. Powerful in the sense of changing what the people around him believe is possible. When Oliver dies for his family, it is a refutation of everything the Viltrumite Empire stands for. It says, there is something more important than strength. There is something worth dying for that has nothing to do with conquest. And every Viltrumite who witnesses it, or learns about it later, has to reckon with that. They have to reckon with the fact that the weakest among them was the one who understood something fundamental about existence that the strongest never could. Keep that in mind, because it comes back. Now, there is one more thing worth mentioning about Oliver before we move on, and it has to do with his role in the animated series. If you are watching the show, you have seen Oliver arrive as a baby and begin to grow at that alarming accelerated rate. The show has done an excellent job of capturing the strangeness of his situation, the way everyone around him has to constantly adjust to the fact that the child they met last season now looks like a teenager. That visual storytelling reinforces something the comics could only suggest through dialogue and narration. Oliver is out of time. He is always out of time. His body is rushing toward a maturity that his experiences cannot match. And the people who love him are constantly aware that they are watching someone live an entire life on fast forward. Every moment with Oliver carries an urgency that no other character in the series has, because every moment might be one of the last. That urgency makes his final sacrifice even more devastating, because you realize that Oliver did not just give up his life, he gave up the only thing he never had enough of: time. The animated series has not yet reached Oliver's death in the comics, and when it does, it will likely be one of the most emotionally impactful moments in the entire show. Fans who know the source material are already bracing for it, and fans who do not know what is coming are going to be absolutely gutted. Because the show has done something the comics could not quite accomplish in the same way. It has given you time with Oliver. Real, accumulated, season over season time. You have watched him grow. You have watched him struggle with his identity and his heritage, and his place in a family that is itself struggling to figure out what it is. And when that chapter ends, when the moment comes, the weight of all those accumulated moments is going to hit like nothing else in the series. Now we move up, and the next tier of Viltrumites we need to discuss represents the backbone of the Empire. The soldiers, the rank and file, the nameless warriors who make up the military machine, and the named ones who give us our clearest window into what standard Viltrumite power actually looks like in practice. The best examples are the 3 executioners sent to track down Nolan Grayson after he abandoned his mission on Earth: Lucan, Thula, and in the animated series, Vidor. These 3 are not generals, they are not strategists or leaders or visionaries. They are enforcement. When a Viltrumite goes rogue, the Empire dispatches warriors to find them and bring them back, or kill them trying. Lucan, Thula, and Vidor are that kind of warrior. Competent, obedient, powerful enough to make the assignment stick. Each one possesses the full suite of standard Viltrumite abilities: strength measured in the hundreds of tons, speed sufficient to cross continents in minutes, durability that allows them to shrug off attacks that would annihilate any conventional military force. Lucan in particular is noted as being over 2,000 years old, which means his abilities have been compounding for 2 millennia. Even among Viltrumites, that is a meaningful amount of accumulated power. 2,000 years of getting stronger. 2,000 years of combat experience, 2,000 years of surviving the kind of violence that would end most species. And Lucan is considered unremarkable by the standards of the Viltrumite elite. That tells you something about the scale we are dealing with. Their mission to find Nolan gives us one of the most useful benchmarks in the entire series for understanding where standard Viltrumites sit relative to other powerful beings. On their way to Thraxa, the 3 executioners encounter Alan the alien, who is at that point one of the strongest fighters in the coalition of planets. Alan is a being specifically bred and enhanced to be a champion. His strength rivals many Viltrumites on a good day. And the 3 executioners beat him nearly to death just to extract information about Nolan's whereabouts. Think about that for a moment. Alan the alien is an elite combatant by the standards of the wider galaxy. He is a being that most civilizations would consider an existential threat, and 3 standard Viltrumite soldiers treat him like an obstacle to be dealt with on the way to their actual objective. That is what the floor looks like for this species. That is what you get from Viltrumites who are not special, who are not leaders, who are just doing their jobs. The floor is already higher than most ceilings. When the trio reaches Thraxa and confronts Nolan, the resulting battle gives us more useful data points. Thula, the female member of the group, is briefly overpowered by an enraged Mark. This is significant because at this point in the series, Mark is still in the early to middle phase of his power development. He has not yet fought conquest. He has not yet participated in the Viltrumite War. He has not yet reached anything close to his eventual peak. And yet, in a burst of fury, he manages to gain the upper hand on Thula. She recovers quickly, and this is where the encounter becomes a lesson in the fundamental difference between how Viltrumites and humans approach combat. Mark hesitates. He has the advantage. Thula is down, and instead of pressing the attack, instead of doing what any trained Viltrumite warrior would do without a second thought, Mark pauses, because Mark was raised by a human mother in a human home with human values, and those values include the instinct that you do not keep hitting someone who is already beaten. That instinct, noble and compassionate as it is, nearly gets him killed. Thula stabs him with a blade when he hesitates to finish her off, because Viltrumites are trained from birth to punish mercy and exploit weakness. Hesitate for 1 second, and that second is all a Viltrumite needs to turn the fight around. Mercy is not a virtue in Viltrumite combat. It is a vulnerability, and Thula exploits it without hesitation, because that is what she was raised to do. But the fact that mid-development Mark can briefly overpower her tells you something concrete about where Thula sits. She is an average Viltrumite soldier, incredibly dangerous by any external standard, but unremarkable within the hierarchy of her own species. Lucan is the more interesting case. After sustaining what looked like a fatal injury during the fight on Thraxa, Lucan survived. Not only survived, but came back to severely wound Omni-Man. That resilience, that sheer refusal to stay down, is what separates Lucan from the other soldiers in his tier. He lasted longer than expected. He fought beyond the point where his injuries should have stopped him. And while he still was not strong enough to change the overall outcome of the battle, his durability suggests he sits near the top of the standard soldier class. If the soldier tier were its own ranking, Lucan would be near the top, not because he hits harder than the others, but because he simply will not stop. There is a lesson in that, and it foreshadows how Mark eventually wins his most important fight. There is something worth exploring about what Lucan specifically tells us about the nature of Viltrumite endurance. When the Viltrumite executioners arrive on Thraxa and the battle begins, Lucan takes damage that appears fatal. He should be done. Any rational assessment of his injuries would conclude that this fighter is finished, and yet he comes back. He re-enters the fight and lands a blow on Omni-Man that genuinely wounds one of the strongest Viltrumites in existence. That moment is easy to overlook in the chaos of the Thraxa battle, but it contains a fundamental truth about this species that applies at every level of the ranking. Viltrumites do not process damage the way other beings do. Pain is not a stop signal for them. It is closer to fuel. The worse a fight gets, the more desperate a Viltrumite becomes, and desperation in a being with this kind of biology is not weakness. It is escalation. A Viltrumite who is losing a fight is, in some ways, more dangerous than one who is winning, because the losing Viltrumite has nothing left to protect. No ego, no strategy, just the raw biological imperative to survive, channeled through a body that can crack a continent. Lucan demonstrates this principle in miniature. He is not special. He is not elite. He's just a soldier who refuses to acknowledge that his body has reached its limit. And that refusal, that sheer bloody-minded stubbornness in the face of catastrophic injury, is not a Lucan trait. It is a Viltrumite trait. You see it echoed in every single fighter higher on this list. You see it in Conquest, who laughs through his own dismemberment. You see it in Nolan, who keeps fighting with his organs exposed. You see it in Mark, who holds a chokehold with his intestines hanging out. And you see it in Thrag, who fights for days with his guts spilling from an open wound. The refusal to stop is the through line of this entire species. Lucan just happens to be the first one on this list who shows it to you clearly. Vidor, who is an original character created for the animated series rather than the comics, fills out the trio and helps establish the pattern. 3 soldiers sent as a group, not because any individual soldier is weak, far from it, but because their target is Nolan Grayson, and even 3 might not be enough for a Viltrumite of his caliber. The Empire sends soldiers in groups for the dangerous assignments. When they send someone alone, that someone is an entirely different class of threat. Remember that distinction. It becomes important very soon. Moving up from the soldier tier, we enter territory that is significantly more complex. The next Viltrumite on this list blurs the line between soldier and weapon, between warrior and force of nature. Her name is Anissa, and she represents one of the most formidable individual combatants the Viltrum Empire ever deployed. Anissa is the kind of Viltrumite the Empire trusts with solo operations. When she appears in the comics, she is sent to Earth alone to handle the situation that Nolan botched. Her orders are to either recruit or coerce Mark into cooperating with the Viltrumite plan for Earth. She tries diplomacy first, approaching Mark with a directness that borders on clinical. When diplomacy fails, and it fails almost immediately because Mark is not his father, Anissa shifts to the alternative approach without hesitation. Their first fight is not a contest, it is a demonstration. Anissa dominates Mark from the opening exchange. Her punches generate shockwaves that send him tumbling across the landscape like a rag doll. She kicks him into the ground with enough force to carve craters. She handles him with the calm efficiency of someone who is working well within her comfort zone, because the disparity between them at that stage of the series is genuinely that large. Mark is already a capable hero by then. He has fought monsters and aliens and his own father, but Anissa handles him like sparring practice. What makes Anissa particularly notable in a power ranking context is her speed. Among the full range of Viltrumite abilities, speed is the one where Anissa truly excels. She is noted, even among the most experienced members of her species, as being exceptionally fast. In fights between beings of comparable strength, the fighter who can close distance faster, land more hits, dodge and counter more effectively, tends to win even against a slightly stronger opponent. And Anissa has more speed than almost anyone in her tier. It makes her a terror in close combat, the kind of fighter who connects 4 times before you have finished processing the first impact. If you have ever watched a boxing match where one fighter is simply faster, where the slower fighter never seems to get set before the next combination arrives, you understand why speed matters as much as raw power. And Anissa has more of it than almost any Viltrumite alive. But Anissa has clearly defined limits. During the Coalition's assault on Viltrum, she is stymied by both Alan the Alien, who by then has been enhanced significantly beyond his earlier levels, and Battle Beast, the warrior from another world whose raw power puts him in the conversation with the strongest Viltrumites. Against beings of that caliber, Anissa's speed advantage narrows and her raw power is not sufficient to compensate. She is overwhelmed by opponents who combine strength with durability that can absorb her fastest combinations. Thetis, the ancient Viltrumite rebel, also overpowers Anissa during the Viltrumite War. This establishes a clear ceiling. Anissa is above the soldier class. She is above most individual Viltrumites, but the oldest and most powerful members of the species operate on a level she cannot reach, at least not yet. Given another 1,000 years of accumulated strength, who knows? But within the time frame of the series, Anissa is mid to upper tier, extremely dangerous, but not elite. Her character arc in the comics takes several dark turns that complicate her role in the story. The animated series will eventually have to navigate that material, and how it handles those arcs will likely generate significant discussion among fans who know the source material. But what matters for this ranking is where her story ends, not where it goes dark. Anissa dies in the final battle. She fights against Thrag's hybrid children to protect Adam Eve, the partner of the person she once tried to force into compliance. The irony is sharp and deliberate. A Viltrumite soldier who spent her life following orders from the Empire dies breaking those orders to protect someone she was once ordered to subjugate. Her injuries from the battle are too severe. She bleeds out, and in her final moments, she is not a Viltrumite warrior. She is just a person who chose something better than what she was made for. And if that is not a definition of growth, if that is not evidence that beings can change no matter how deeply their conditioning runs, then nothing is. Anissa's death is quiet compared to the cosmic scale battles that surround it, but it might be one of the most meaningful deaths in the entire series. And if you step back and think about Anissa's power in the broader context of Viltrumite combat philosophy, her speed advantage reveals something important about how fights between beings of similar strength tiers actually play out. When two Viltrumites are close in raw power, the fight does not come down to who hits hardest. It comes down to who hits first, who hits most often, and who can control the rhythm of the exchange. Anissa understood this intuitively. Her fighting style was not about delivering one overwhelming blow. It was about volume. Constant, relentless pressure. A barrage of strikes that never gave her opponent time to set their feet, time to plan a counter, time to do anything except absorb punishment. Against Viltrumites in her tier and below, this approach was devastating. She could overwhelm fighters who were technically her equals in raw strength, simply because she was hitting them 4 times for every 1 time they could hit her. That kind of speed differential compounds rapidly in a fight. After 30 seconds, the slower fighter has taken dozens of unanswered blows. After a minute, their durability is being tested at a rate their healing factor cannot match in real time. After 5 minutes, they are losing consciousness. And after 10, they are dead or broken beyond the point where their biology can recover before the next blow lands. That is what made Anissa a solo operative. Not just her power, which was considerable. Her tempo, she fought at a tempo that most of her opponents simply could not match. And in Viltrumite combat, tempo kills. Notice the pattern. Oliver dies protecting his brother. Anissa dies protecting Eve. The weakest and the middle of the ranking both end their stories with acts of sacrifice that have nothing to do with power. The series keeps telling you this. The ranking measures strength. The story measures something else entirely. Above Anissa sits General Craig, second in command of the Viltrum Empire, the highest ranking officer beneath Thrag himself, and a character who represents a different kind of power than anyone below him on this list. Craig is a strategist. That is his primary function and his primary value to the Empire. He designs invasion plans. He coordinates the logistics of subjugating entire worlds. He oversees the deployment of Viltrumite forces across thousands of planets. When the Empire needs a military operation designed and executed, Craig is the architect. In a civilization that values strength above all else, Craig has reached the second highest position through a combination of physical capability and intellectual acuity that is rare among his kind. Most Viltrumites punch their way up the hierarchy. Craig thinks his way there and punches his way when necessary. Physically, Craig possesses the full range of standard Viltrumite powers, refined by centuries of experience and augmented by his considerable age. He can traverse a planet in minutes. He can survive engagements with the most powerful fighters in the galaxy. His durability allowed him to survive the Scourge virus, which killed over 99% of the species, though it cost him his right eye. The virus, which attacks Viltrumite biology at its core, strips away their powers and leaves them vulnerable to the kind of death they were designed to avoid. That Craig survived it at all places, him among the toughest members of an already impossibly tough species. But combat tells the story of where Craig actually sits, and that story is one of consistent near misses. He engages Thetis during the attack on Tailskria and is overpowered. He fights Nolan Grayson and is outmatched. During the Viltrumite War, he clashes with Thetis again and manages to worsen an existing back injury, showing that he can genuinely hurt even the most powerful Viltrumites in the series. But he is ultimately overpowered once more. He briefly battles Alan the alien before escaping with Thrag's help. The pattern is consistent and revealing. Craig can survive fights with the absolute elite. He can land meaningful blows on beings who rank above him. He can push them, test them, make them work for their victories. But he cannot win those fights. There is a gap between Craig and the tier above him, and it is just wide enough to be the difference between dangerous and legendary. Craig is a hurricane. The beings above him are extinction events, and that gap is not something you can close through strategy or determination. It is a gap of accumulated power, of centuries of biological compounding that Craig simply has not had enough time to complete. What makes Craig genuinely interesting beyond his power level is the character development he undergoes in the later comics. Like Nolan, like so many Viltrumites in this story, Craig changes. His time on Earth, living among humans under the Empire's eventual policy of integration rather than conquest, actually affects him. There are moments in the later issues where this ruthless military strategist, this designer of planetary invasions, shows something that looks remarkably like compassion. He begins to care about the people around him. He begins to understand that there might be values beyond strength and conquest. It is a quieter transformation than Nolan's dramatic redemption, but it is real, and it speaks to one of the central arguments of the entire series, that even the most hardened warriors can change. That the culture you were raised in does not have to be the culture you die defending. What is perhaps most underappreciated about Craig is the sheer improbability of his position. In a species that resolves every hierarchy through violence, the second in command is a thinker. Consider what that means. Every other Viltrumite in the Empire could, in theory, challenge Craig for his rank. That is how Viltrumite hierarchy works. You want someone's position? You fight for it. And yet, no one challenges Craig. Not because he would win every fight. He would not. There are Viltrumites stronger than him. But because even the strongest Viltrumites recognize on some level that what Craig provides cannot be replaced by someone who just hits harder. He is the organizational mind behind the entire Imperial military structure. Remove him and the Empire does not just lose a general. It loses the ability to coordinate across a galactic theater. Conquest can destroy a planet, but he cannot design a campaign that takes 40 planets in sequence without overextending supply lines. Thrag can kill anyone who opposes him, but even Thrag relies on Craig to tell him where to point that killing power for maximum strategic effect. Craig survives in a society of predators because he is the one predator who understands logistics, and logistics are the skeleton that holds the body of any empire together. Without them, you just have strong individuals punching things. With them, you have civilization, even a civilization as brutal as Viltrum. His survival through the Scourge virus is itself a testament to his resilience. The virus attacked Viltrumite biology at its most fundamental level, stripping away their enhanced immune systems and leaving them vulnerable to the kind of biological entropy that their species had evolved beyond. Craig lost his right eye to the virus. That scar, that permanent reminder of the moment his species nearly ended, became a defining feature of his character in the later comics. He wears it openly, no prosthetic, no attempt to hide it. The missing eye is both a wound and a statement. It says, "I survived the worst thing that ever happened to my species, and I am still here." For a culture that values strength, there is no stronger statement than a scar you refuse to conceal. Now we move into a tier that changes the nature of the conversation entirely, because the next Viltrumite on this list is not just powerful, he is ancient. He is the being who struck the first blow against the Viltrumite Empire from within, and his story raises questions about the nature of power that physical strength alone can never answer. Thetis. If age is the primary driver of Viltrumite power, and it is, then Thetis has an advantage over almost every other being on this list that cannot be overcome by training, or talent, or genetic selection. He is simply that old. The comics do not specify his exact age, but the evidence suggests he has been alive since before the Great Purge, before the modern empire, before Thrag's rise to power. He predates the current Viltrumite order entirely, and every single year of that existence has been compounding his power, making him stronger, harder, more durable than younger Viltrumites could ever be in the same time frame. But Thetis is unique on this list for a reason that has nothing to do with physical power. He is the first Viltrumite in the history of his species to rebel, to look at what Viltrum was becoming under Argol's rule and say, this has to stop, to put a knife in the Emperor's back, not for personal gain, not for political advantage, but because he believed that what his species was doing to the galaxy was wrong. That moral clarity is extraordinary coming from a Viltrumite. Remember what we discussed about their culture, the Great Purge, the systematic elevation of strength above all other values, the conquest of entire civilizations. Thetis grew up in that culture, he was shaped by it, he fought its wars, and then, at some point in his ancient life, he looked at the blood on his hands and decided that enough was enough. The fact that he made that decision at all, that a single Viltrumite could break free of the programming that defined his entire species, is arguably his most impressive feat. More impressive than the assassination. More impressive than any battle he ever won. What separates Thetis from every other rebel, every other dissenter in the history of the Viltrumite Empire is the scale of his follow-through. It is one thing to disagree. It is one thing to look at an atrocity and feel revulsion. Many Viltrumites probably felt that revulsion at some point during the Empire's long history of conquest. The difference is that Thetis acted, and he did not just act in the moment. He did not just kill Argol and hope for the best. He planned across centuries. He built institutions. He recruited allies from dozens of species. He organized logistics across interstellar distances. He developed weapons. He created a movement that could outlive him, that could continue to resist the Empire even if he himself were captured or killed. That is not just bravery. That is vision operating on a timescale that most beings, even most Viltrumites, cannot comprehend. Thetis was playing a game that lasted longer than most civilizations exist, and he was winning. After killing Argol and fleeing into the galaxy, Thetis spent centuries building the Coalition of Planets. This is the interstellar alliance that eventually grows into the primary opposition to the Viltrumite Empire, an organization that unites dozens of alien civilizations under a shared commitment to resisting Viltrumite expansion. Thetis recruited worlds, built infrastructure, trained soldiers, and created a military and diplomatic framework capable of challenging the most powerful species in the universe. All of this while being hunted by his own kind. All of this while knowing that if the Empire ever found him, they would kill him without hesitation. And then there is the Scourge virus. Thetis did not just build an army, he built a weapon. Using his knowledge of Viltrumite biology, his own DNA as a foundation, Thetis engineered a pathogen specifically designed to kill Viltrumites. And it worked beyond what anyone could have predicted. The virus killed 99.9% of the remaining population. Nearly total extinction, caused by one being who understood his own species well enough to exploit the vulnerabilities they did not know they had. Before his death, Thetis was working on an even more virulent strain, a version that might have finished the job entirely. Think about the scale of that threat. A single intellect more dangerous to the Viltrumite species than all the armies of the galaxy combined. Not through superior firepower, through superior understanding. Thetis proves that in the Invincible universe, brains can beat brawn on a civilizational scale. In physical combat, Thetis demonstrates the fearsome advantage of his extreme age. During the Viltrumite War, he overpowers Anissa and General Craig, two warriors who would be among the most dangerous beings on any other battlefield, with something approaching ease. He is strong enough to be one of only 3 Viltrumites who fly through the core of planet Viltrum and shatter it. Alongside Nolan and Mark with Space Racer's gun destabilizing the core, Thetis helps destroy the homeworld of his own species. That is planet-level power. Only a handful of beings in the series can claim it. There is an interesting philosophical dimension to Thetis that connects directly to the power ranking itself. Thetis is proof that a Viltrumite's most dangerous weapon is not their fists. It is their mind. Every other Viltrumite on this list is measured primarily by what they can destroy through direct physical contact. How hard they punch, how fast they fly, how much damage they can absorb. But Thetis' greatest weapon was a virus, an idea translated into biology, a thought experiment that killed more Viltrumites than every external army in galactic history combined. When you rank Viltrumites by combat power alone, Thetis sits in the upper tier but not at the top. When you rank them by total threat, by the sheer scale of damage they have actually inflicted on the universe, Thetis is in a category by himself. He is the only Viltrumite who came within a fraction of a percentage point of exterminating his own species. Thrag, for all his power, never accomplished anything on that scale. Conquest, for all his centuries of planetary destruction, never came close. Thetis proves that in the right hands, knowledge is the ultimate weapon. And the Viltrumite Empire, which spent millennia suppressing intellectual independence in favor of physical obedience, created the conditions for its own near extinction by failing to understand that. But even Thetis has a ceiling, and it is the same ceiling that defines this entire ranking. After the destruction of Viltrum in a moment of volcanic rage, Thrag decapitates him. One swing. The head comes off, then Thrag crushes the skull for good measure. The oldest rebel Viltrumite, the founder of the Coalition, the mind that engineered the near extinction of his species. Dead in seconds. Because Thrag exists in a tier that even thousands of years of accumulated power cannot reach. And this is where things start to get really interesting, because now we leave the realm of the powerful and enter the realm of the mythic. Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man. There is an argument to be made that Nolan is the most important character in the Invincible series. Not the protagonist, that is Mark. Not the most powerful, that is Thrag. But the most important, in the sense that his choices, his failures, his redemption, and his death form the emotional spine around which everything else is constructed. Every Viltrumite on this list exists in some relationship to Nolan. He is the standard against which they are all measured, either exceeding him or falling short. He is the lens through which we first understand what it means to be a Viltrumite, and the mirror through which we eventually understand what it means to stop being one. If you think about it, Nolan's entire story is a test of the Viltrumite belief system. He was sent to Earth to weaken its defenses, to integrate into human society, gain their trust, and prepare them for eventual takeover. That was his mission, and he was expected to carry it out the way every other Viltrumite agent had carried out similar missions on thousands of other worlds. Show up, blend in, report back, and when the time comes, help your species absorb another civilization into the Empire. But something happened that the Empire did not account for. Nolan started to care. Not immediately. Not obviously. But over the decades he spent on Earth, living as a human, building a life with Debbie, watching his son grow up, Nolan developed something that Viltrumite training was supposed to make impossible. He developed attachments. Real ones. The kind that make you hesitate when the moment comes to do what you were sent to do. And that hesitation, that tiny crack in the Viltrumite armor of purpose, is what saves Earth. It is what saves Mark, and it is ultimately what destroys Nolan, because a Viltrumite who hesitates is a Viltrumite who can no longer fulfill his function, and a being without a function has to find a new reason to exist. Nolan spends the rest of the series trying to find that reason, and he does, eventually, but the cost is everything. There is something else about Nolan that does not get discussed enough, and it has to do with the massacre of the Guardians of the Globe. That scene, whether you encountered it in the comics or the animated series, is designed to shock, and it does. But if you sit with it longer, if you think about what Nolan was actually doing in that room, the shock gives way to something more disturbing. Understanding. Nolan killed the Guardians because he had to, not in the moral sense, in the strategic sense. His mission required it. Earth's defenses had to be weakened for the eventual Viltrumite takeover, and the Guardians were the strongest defense Earth had. So Nolan walked into their headquarters, a place where he had worked alongside these people, fought beside them, shared meals and conversations and the camaraderie of shared purpose, and he dismantled them, one by one, with his hands. The speed of it is what haunts you. These are not easy targets. The Guardians are the Invincible Universe's answer to the most powerful superhero team imaginable, and Nolan goes through them in minutes. Not because he is careless, because he is efficient. He knows their weaknesses. He has studied them for years, cataloging vulnerabilities while smiling across the conference table. Every handshake was reconnaissance. Every team exercise was a combat assessment. Nolan was calculating their destruction while attending their holiday parties, and when the moment came, all those calculations paid off with terrifying precision. That is the real horror of Nolan Grayson. Not the power itself, though the power is staggering. The horror is the capacity for sustained deception. For years of genuine seeming connection that were, at their foundation, built on the assumption that eventually he would need to kill these people. That takes something beyond physical strength. It takes a kind of psychological compartmentalization that most beings, even most Viltrumites, would struggle to maintain over decades. Nolan held two realities in his mind simultaneously for years. The reality where he cared about Earth and the reality where he was preparing to betray it. And the fact that both realities were in some twisted way genuine, that Nolan actually did care about the people he was planning to destroy, is what makes his redemption possible. Because the caring was never fake. It was just supposed to be secondary. The mission came first, except eventually it did not. But tonight we are talking about power. So let us talk about power. Nolan Grayson is one of the strongest Viltrumites who ever lived. Not the strongest, that distinction belongs to someone we have not reached yet. But Nolan occupies a tier that only a handful of beings in the universe can claim to share. When he stops holding back, when the restraints come off, the things Nolan can do redefine what the audience understands about the scale of threats in this world. Consider the Guardians of the Globe, the most powerful superhero team on Earth. The Invincible Universe's answer to the Justice League. Heroes who have protected the planet for years, who have defeated alien invasions, who represent the pinnacle of superpowered defense. Nolan walks into their headquarters and kills nearly all of them in minutes. Not in a drawn-out battle, not in a close fight that could have gone either way. He executes them with the cold efficiency of someone performing a routine task. That moment tells you everything you need to know about the gap between Viltrumite power and everything else on Earth. The best humanity has to offer is a minor inconvenience to Nolan Grayson. He travels to the Flaxen dimension and annihilates an entire interdimensional civilization. An entire species, wiped out because Nolan decided they needed to be gone. He can fly at speeds that allow him to cross interstellar distances in days. He can survive in the vacuum of space indefinitely. His durability lets him endure impacts that would crack the surface of a moon. He can withstand temperatures hotter than the surface of a star in short bursts. And he is one of only 3 beings in the series capable of flying through a planet's core and coming out the other side. Nolan also fought alongside the coalition of planets during the Viltrumite War, turning against his own species in one of the most significant defections in the history of the conflict. When a being of Nolan's power switches sides, it is not just a symbolic gesture, it is a strategic earthquake. The Coalition gained one of the most powerful fighters in the galaxy, and the Empire lost one. The net swing in combat capability was enormous, and Nolan did not just show up. He fought. He bled, he put his body between the Coalition soldiers and his former comrades. And he did it knowing that every Viltrumite on the other side would consider him a traitor worthy of the most painful death imaginable. There is also the matter of how Nolan's power grew over the course of the series, and what that growth tells you about the emotional dimension of Viltrumite strength. When Nolan first arrives on Earth, he is already immensely powerful. Thousands of years old, battle-hardened, carrying the accumulated strength of millennia. But there is an argument to be made that Nolan actually gets stronger during his time among humans, not just through the passive compounding of Viltrumite biology, but through something the Empire never accounted for: motivation. A Viltrumite who fights because it is their duty fights at one level. A Viltrumite who fights because they are protecting something they love fights at another level entirely. And Nolan, after his confrontation with Mark, after losing everything and then slowly rebuilding his sense of purpose, becomes a fighter with something to protect: his family, his son, the fragile, impossible life he accidentally built on a planet he was supposed to betray. That emotional anchor does not change the physics of his punches, but it changes the psychology behind them. It changes when he decides to push past pain, when he decides to keep fighting beyond the point where tactical wisdom says to retreat, when he decides that losing is simply not an option because the cost of losing is too high. The Empire trained Nolan to fight for dominance. Earth taught him to fight for love, and a Viltrumite fighting for love is, in ways that no ranking can fully capture, more dangerous than one fighting for an empire. His relationship with Alan the alien during this period is fascinating. Alan had been enhanced by the Coalition to be a match for Viltrumites, and the two of them formed a partnership built on mutual respect and, eventually, genuine friendship. A Viltrumite and an Unopan, 2 species that should have been enemies, fighting side by side against the Empire. It is one of many examples in the series of alliances that transcend the divisions the Empire tried to enforce. That destruction of Viltrum deserves particular emphasis. Nolan, Mark, and Thetis destroyed planet Viltrum by flying through it. The homeworld of the most powerful species in the universe, shattered by 3 beings striking it simultaneously after Space Racer's weapon destabilizes its core. The planet breaks apart, and Nolan is one of the 3 who make it happen. That is a level of raw physical power that most superhero fiction does not even attempt to depict. When people talk about planet-level characters in fiction, they are usually speaking hypothetically. Nolan actually did it. He flew through a planet, and he survived. But Nolan's ceiling is defined by the one being he can never beat, Thrag. They fight multiple times throughout the comics, and while Nolan can survive those encounters, while he can make Thrag exert effort, the result is always the same. Thrag wins. The gap is not enormous. It is not the kind of gap that exists between Thrag and, say, Oliver. Nolan can hurt Thrag. He can push him. He can make the Grand Regent take him seriously. But when the dust settles, Thrag is standing and Nolan is not. Their final encounter is the one that ends Nolan's life. Thrag rips Nolan's heart from his chest, literally reaches in and tears it free. And because Viltrumites cannot regenerate from catastrophic heart damage, Nolan dies. His last words to his son are two syllables that carry the weight of every choice he ever made, every life he ever took, every mistake he ever tried to atone for. Be better. That is all. Be better than me. Be better than what our species has been. Be better than the empire that shaped us both. There is one more thing about Nolan that this ranking needs to address, and it is the single quality that makes him both more and less dangerous than his raw power level would suggest. Nolan Grayson is emotionally vulnerable, and in a species that considers emotional attachment a defect, that vulnerability is simultaneously his greatest weakness and the reason he matters more than Viltrumites who are physically his superior. Conquest is stronger than Nolan in his prime. Thrag is vastly stronger, but neither of them would ever hesitate in a fight because they heard their son screaming. Neither of them would stay their hand because a memory of their wife's face surfaced at the wrong moment. Nolan would, and does. His emotional connections create openings that a purely rational combatant would exploit. And throughout the series, his enemies do exactly that. They target his family. They threaten the people he loves. They use his heart as a weapon against him. And every time, it works. Not because Nolan is weak, because Nolan cares. And caring in a fight between beings who can shatter moons is a liability that no amount of physical conditioning can eliminate. But it is also the thing that makes Nolan worth following. The other Viltrumites who eventually rally to Mark's cause do not do it because Mark is the strongest. They do it because Mark's father showed them, through decades of messy, contradictory, painful example, that there is something beyond the Empire's philosophy. That a Viltrumite who loves is not a broken Viltrumite. He is just a Viltrumite who has found something the Empire never offered. A reason to fight that is not about dominance. Nolan Grayson dies redeemed. He dies protecting the planet he once tried to conquer for an empire he no longer believes in. He dies as a father, not a soldier. And in terms of raw Viltrumite power, he sits just below the summit. Planet-level strength, thousands of years of combat experience, enough power to destroy civilizations by himself, and still not quite enough to survive the one being who was manufactured to stand above everyone else. But that is not even the strangest part, because now we need to talk about Mark. And Mark Grayson's relationship with power is the most complicated, most dynamic, and most thematically rich thread in the entire Invincible series. Invincible. The name is ironic for most of the comic, because Mark Grayson gets beaten up more than almost any superhero in the history of the medium. He breaks bones with alarming regularity. He loses fights that more experienced Viltrumites would win without effort. He ends up in hospital beds so often that the other characters start to comment on it. The running joke of the series, acknowledged within the story itself, is that for a hero named Invincible, Mark is remarkably vincible. And yet, by the end, he earns the name. Not through effortless dominance, not through some sudden power unlock that makes him unstoppable. He earns it by getting back up every single time. No matter how badly he is broken, no matter how devastating the defeat, Mark Grayson stands back up and goes again. And that quality, that specific refusal to stay down, is what eventually makes him the most powerful Viltrumite alive. When Mark first gets his powers at 17, he is barely a blip on the Viltrumite scale. Strong enough to handle street-level crime, strong enough to impress the normal humans around him. But his father holds back during training because a full-power punch from Nolan would kill his son at this stage. Mark is a Viltrumite in name only. His power has not yet begun to compound. The first major demonstration of where Mark truly stands comes during the fight with his father at the end of the first arc. It is the most lopsided significant battle in the series. Nolan breaks Mark's body, beats him through buildings, through mountains, through the earth itself. The shockwaves from their impacts kill civilians below. Nolan is not trying to kill Mark. Not entirely, but even at reduced intensity, the damage is catastrophic. Mark survives because Nolan cannot bring himself to finish the job. Not because Mark is strong enough to endure it, because his father still loves him enough to stop. By the middle of the series, Mark's growth starts to become apparent. He punches Alan the alien hard enough to send him crashing into the moon. That is country-level striking power from a Viltrumite who has only had his abilities for a few years. The rate of his improvement startles even the Viltrumites who are aware of it, because Mark is getting stronger faster than his age should allow. Something about his hybrid genetics, some interaction between human and Viltrumite DNA, is accelerating his development. The human side is not making him weaker, it might actually be making him grow faster. And then there is the question of what Mark's hybrid biology actually means for his development curve. The comics hint at something that the characters themselves do not fully understand. Mark gets stronger faster than he should. His growth rate outpaces what a half Viltrumite of his age would be expected to achieve based on the Empire's knowledge of hybrid physiology. Something about the combination of human and Viltrumite DNA is producing results that neither species alone would generate. The human genome is not diluting the Viltrumite power set. It might actually be catalyzing it. Think of it as hybrid vigor, the same phenomenon that occurs in agriculture and animal breeding, where the offspring of two genetically distinct parents sometimes outperforms either parent in specific traits. Mark's human side gives his Viltrumite biology something it has never had before: genetic novelty, variation. And that variation, rather than weakening him, might be creating pathways for adaptation that pure Viltrumite biology cannot access. It is deeply ironic. The Empire believed that mixing with other species would weaken the bloodline, and in Mark's case, the evidence suggests the exact opposite. The mixing made him stronger, or at least, it made him capable of becoming stronger faster than his age alone would predict. Then, Conquest arrives, and everything changes. The first Conquest fight spans issues 61 through 64, and is the most brutal, most disturbing, and most transformative battle in the series up to that point. Conquest is operating at a level that makes every previous opponent Mark has faced look like a warm-up. He breaks Mark's leg with a single punch, shatters his hand, impales Adam Eve, nearly kills Oliver with a casual backhand, and through all of it, Conquest is grinning, laughing, having the time of his life. This is a being who has spent thousands of years conquering worlds, and fighting Mark Grayson is the most fun he has had in centuries. That is how little regard he has for Mark's power at this point. It is entertainment. Mark wins. Barely. After Eve fires an energy blast that burns much of Conquest's skin away, Mark headbutts the old warrior's face into an unrecognizable ruin of bone and tissue until Conquest loses consciousness. And then, Mark collapses. He nearly dies from the accumulated damage. He spends weeks recovering, and when he comes back, he is different. The innocence is gone. The belief that he can handle whatever comes next through determination and good intentions alone is gone. Mark has seen what real Viltrumite combat looks like, and it has broken something inside him that never fully heals. The second Conquest fight, during the Viltrumite War around issues 71 and 72, is even more revealing. Conquest returns, thrilled to have another chance, and Mark makes a tactical decision that demonstrates how much he has grown. He does not try to outpunch a being who outclasses him in raw strength. Instead, he grabs Conquest by the throat and squeezes. Simple. Primal. Effective, and Conquest, desperate to break free, unleashes everything he has. He impales Mark, disembowels him, shatters his spine, inflicts damage so catastrophic that Mark should be dead several times over. Mark does not let go. He holds the grip through pain that defies description, through injuries that would kill any being who was not too stubborn to acknowledge them. And Conquest, the joyful destroyer, the thousand-year conqueror of worlds, suffocates to death in the arms of a half-human who simply would not open his hands. After that fight, Mark spends months in a hospital bed. Issues 73 and 74 of the comic show the slow, painful process of his body rebuilding itself. But the Viltrumite growth cycle applies. Push the body past its limits, survive, and come back stronger. Mark has been pushed further than almost any Viltrumite in recorded history, and each time he survives, his baseline rises. Against Battle Beast, one of the most powerful non-Viltrumite warriors in the comic, Mark loses badly. This is humbling and important. It teaches him that power is not exclusive to Viltrumites, and that even with his growing abilities, there are beings out there who can match or exceed him through entirely different evolutionary paths. Battle Beast beats Mark and walks away without a scratch. That loss matters because it strips away any complacency Mark might have developed. He is not special just because he is a Viltrumite. He has to earn every bit of power he accumulates. And then the final arc arrives, and everything Mark has endured converges. By this point, Adam Eve has given Mark a power boost through her reality warping abilities. His years of devastating combat, the accumulated damage and recovery, his Viltrumite biology compounding his strength, and Eve's enhancement all combined to push Mark into a tier he was never supposed to reach this early in his life. But against Thrag, even this is not enough in a straight fight. So Mark does what Mark does. He adapts, he improvises, he grabs Thrag and flies them both into the sun. Inside the star, their bodies begin to burn. Viltrumites can withstand extreme temperatures, but the sustained heat of a star's surface exceeds even Viltrumite limits over time. Their skin chars, their muscles cook, they become unrecognizable forms, locked in combat inside a nuclear furnace. Robot sends a suit of armor to help Mark, but the solar heat melts it off his body within moments. And in the final seconds, when both of them are more dead than alive, when they are barely identifiable as living beings, Thrag breaks both of Mark's arms, a last desperate act of rage from a being who refuses to die without ensuring his enemy dies first. And Mark, with no arms, no armor, no skin, nothing left but the fundamental core of his identity, lunges forward and bites through Thrag's throat. Alan the alien arrives to pull Mark from the sun. Mark survives. His father is dead. Thrag is dead. The Empire is shattered. And Mark Grayson, the half-human kid who got his powers at 17 and spent 144 issues getting knocked down, becomes the leader of the remaining Viltrumites. Not because he was the strongest, because he was the last one standing. The final issues of the series show Mark living for thousands of years, watching civilizations rise and fall, growing stronger with each passing century, as Viltrumite biology dictates. There is no clear limit on what he might eventually become. Kirkman leaves that open, and it is one of the most satisfying aspects of the ending. There is something else about Mark that this ranking needs to acknowledge, and it is the quality that ultimately separates him from every other Viltrumite on this list. Mark chooses to be good. That sounds simple, but in the context of what he is, it is extraordinary. Mark has enough power to do anything he wants. By the end of the series, he can destroy worlds. He has the strength and the authority to rule the remaining Viltrumites as a tyrant, the way Thrag did, the way Argal did. And he chooses not to. He chooses compassion. He chooses to lead through consensus rather than fear. He chooses to honor his father's dying wish. That choice is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength there is. Because every Viltrumite instinct, every piece of cultural programming in his DNA, is telling him to dominate, to impose his will, to be the strongest and make sure everyone knows it. And Mark overrides all of it, every day, for the rest of his very long life. He becomes the first Viltrumite leader in history who rules not because he can beat everyone else, but because his people trust him. The other Viltrumites follow Mark not because they fear him. They follow him because he's the first leader in their species' history who values them as individuals rather than as resources. That is a revolution, not a violent one, a quiet one. And it might be the most important thing any Viltrumite ever does. In this ranking, Mark sits just below the absolute peak. For most of the series, he is not the strongest Viltrumite. His victory over Thrag is won through strategy and willpower, not raw superiority. In a neutral setting, at full power, with no environmental advantage, Thrag beats him. Mark wins because he chooses the battlefield, because he is willing to die, because no one in the history of this comic book gets back up more times than he does. And there is a beautiful irony in that. The Viltrumite Empire, which valued individual combat supremacy above all else, is ultimately brought down by a half-breed who wins his most important fight by refusing to fight on the Empire's terms. Mark does not beat Thrag by being a better Viltrumite. He beats Thrag by being something Thrag cannot understand. A person who is willing to sacrifice himself not for power, not for dominance, but for other people. The Empire spent millennia breeding the perfect warrior. And in the end, the perfect warrior is beaten by something the Empire bred out of itself generations ago. Love. Stubbornness. The refusal to let the people you care about live in a universe where Thrag still exists. Those are not Viltrumite values. Those are human values. And Mark, half human, carries them into the sun. There is a quality to Mark's fighting that deserves its own discussion, because it connects to something deep in Viltrumite biology that the series explores in subtle ways. Viltrumite rage. Every Viltrumite has access to it. It is not just anger, it is a biological state, a cascade of neurochemical and molecular changes that temporarily amplifies strength, speed, and aggression beyond the fighter's normal baseline. You see it in Nolan when he loses control during the fight with Mark over the city. You see it in Thrag when Viltrum is destroyed and he murders Thetis in a blinding explosion of fury. You see it in Conquest when the fighting reaches its peak intensity and his smile becomes something closer to ecstasy. But in Mark, Viltrumite rage is different. It is not controlled. It is not channeled. When Mark snaps, when the dam breaks and the fury comes out, it is raw and unrefined and catastrophically destructive. During his first fight with Conquest, there are moments where Mark is not fighting with technique or strategy. He is fighting with pure animal desperation, headbutting Conquest's face into pulp, screaming as he strikes, losing himself in the violence in a way that terrifies even the people trying to help him. That loss of control is simultaneously Mark's greatest vulnerability and his most effective weapon. It is a vulnerability because it strips him of the ability to make tactical decisions, to fight smart, to protect the people around him from collateral damage. But it is a weapon because it unlocks a tier of physical output that Mark cannot access through calm, rational fighting. When Mark is calm, he fights at whatever his current baseline happens to be. When Mark is enraged, he fights above it. The Viltrumite rage is, in many ways, the biological echo of everything the Empire was built on. It is the body's way of channeling the millennia of evolutionary pressure that shaped the species. Every generation of Viltrumites that survived the Great Purge, every generation that fought wars across the galaxy, every generation that valued combat above all else, contributed to the development of this biological override. Rage is the Viltrumite body's emergency mode, and in Mark, who carries both Viltrumite aggression and human emotional complexity, the rage is unpredictable. It does not activate on command. It activates when Mark cares too much, when someone he loves is threatened, when the emotional weight of a situation overloads whatever psychological circuit breakers he has developed. And because the trigger is emotional rather than tactical, Mark's opponents can never predict when it will happen. They can be winning a fight decisively, and then they threaten someone Mark loves, and suddenly they are fighting a different person entirely. A person who does not care about winning, who does not care about survival, who only cares about making the threat stop by any means available, including means that would horrify the Mark who exists when the rage subsides. You know, if you stop and think about it, Mark's entire power arc mirrors the arc of the series itself. Invincible starts small, a kid with powers, a local hero, manageable threats, and over 144 issues, the scale expands until you are watching beings fight inside stars over the fate of species. Mark grows with the story. His power level at any given point in the series is almost exactly proportional to the scale of the threat he is facing. Not because of convenient power-ups or lazy writing, but because the growth is earned. Every new tier of power Mark reaches is paid for with broken bones and hospital beds, and fights that nearly kill him. Nothing is free, nothing is given. Everything is earned through suffering, and that is why Mark's ultimate victory feels real in a way that many superhero stories cannot achieve. Now, Conquest. We discussed his fights with Mark in detail, but Conquest deserves his own section because he represents something that no other Viltrumite on this list does. He represents the pure, undiluted joy of destruction. Conquest is sent to planets alone. Let that sink in again. In a species where standard protocol involves dispatching groups of soldiers for dangerous targets, Conquest goes by himself. The Empire points him at a world and waits for confirmation that the world has surrendered. He has been doing this for thousands of years. His entire identity, his name, his purpose, everything he is, revolves around the subjugation of civilizations. His power level places him second only to Thrag among all Viltrumites in the series. Stronger than Omni-Man, stronger than Thetis, stronger than any Viltrumite except the Grand Regent. His cybernetic right arm tells a story that most people miss on first reading. Conquest lost that arm not in some grand battle against a worthy opponent. He lost it to a Ragnar. The Ragnars are among the most physically dangerous, non-sapient species in the Invincible universe, savage, predatory creatures of immense strength that operate on pure instinct. But under normal circumstances, a Viltrumite of Conquest's caliber would handle a Ragnar without losing a limb. The reason Conquest was vulnerable is the Scourge virus. After surviving the virus, there was a brief window where even the surviving Viltrumites were weakened. Their healing factors diminished, their power temporarily suppressed. During that window, Conquest encountered a group of Ragnars on a planet classified as the Savage Planet, and they tore his arm off and scarred his right eye. The injuries that would normally heal in days became permanent because his biology was still recovering from the virus. So Conquest's cybernetic arm is not just a replacement limb, it is a scar from the Scourge virus. A physical reminder that even the second strongest Viltrumite alive was for a brief moment mortal enough to be maimed by a creature that would normally be beneath his notice. And Conquest, being Conquest, turned that scar into a weapon and kept going. The prosthetic is built to withstand the same forces as his biological body, making it a seamless extension of his combat capability. He can draw blood from planet-level fighters with individual punches. He can shatter city blocks with the impact of his flight. He is a walking apocalypse with a grin on his face. And that grin is the thing that makes Conquest truly nightmarish. He is a sadomasochist. He loves battle. He loves inflicting pain. He loves receiving it. Combat is not a duty for Conquest. It is not a necessary evil in service of the Empire's goals. It is the purpose of his existence. The thing that makes him feel most alive. When he fights Mark, he thanks him for the experience. When he takes damage, he laughs. When he inflicts damage, he savors it. This is a being for whom the distinction between winning and losing is almost secondary to the experience of violence itself. That psychology makes him uniquely dangerous because it removes the one thing that makes most fighters predictable: the desire to survive. A rational opponent will retreat when the cost becomes too high. A strategic opponent will disengage when the mission parameters change. Conquest will never retreat. He will never disengage. He will keep fighting until one of you is dead, and he will enjoy every second of the process, including the seconds when he is losing. There is no leverage you can apply to someone who does not care whether they live or die, who only cares that the fight continues. You cannot intimidate Conquest. You cannot make him reconsider. The only way to stop him is to kill him, and he will enjoy the attempt. In the animated series, Conquest appeared in Season 3, and the show captured his menace with impressive fidelity to the source material. His presence immediately escalated the stakes, because Conquest is not just a stronger villain, he is a different kind of villain. One who fights not because he has to, but because fighting is the only state of being that makes sense to him. What is interesting about Conquest from a ranking perspective is how cleanly he separates from the Viltrumites below him. Craig is strong, but Craig would not survive a one-on-one fight with Conquest. Anissa is fast, but her speed would not save her against someone who can absorb everything she throws and keep smiling. Thetis is ancient and brilliant, but even Thetis would struggle against Conquest's combination of raw power and complete indifference to his own survival. Conquest exists in that rarefied tier where only one Viltrumite in all of history can definitively claim to be stronger, and even that Viltrumite would have to work for it. When the Empire needs a planet conquered and there is no room for failure, Conquest is the answer. He has been the answer for thousands of years, and no one has ever found a better one. There is also the matter of how Conquest's 2 fights with Mark function as a before and after photograph of Mark's development as a fighter. In the first fight, Mark is overwhelmed. He fights reactively, absorbing punishment and trying to survive rather than dictating the terms of the engagement. Conquest sets the pace, chooses the angles, controls the distance. Mark is on the back foot for almost the entire fight, and his eventual victory comes not from superior combat ability, but from a burst of desperate fury that catches Conquest off guard. In the second fight, the dynamic has shifted. Mark is still not stronger than Conquest, he is still not faster, but he is smarter. He has learned from the first encounter. He knows that trying to outpunch Conquest is a losing proposition, because Conquest has more raw power and vastly more experience. So instead of fighting Conquest's fight, Mark fights his own. He grabs the throat and squeezes. Simple, inelegant, but devastatingly effective against an opponent who expected a brawl and got a strangling instead. Conquest's response is to escalate to levels of violence that would end any other fighter in the galaxy. He impales Mark, breaks his spine, does everything in his power to make Mark open his hands, and Mark, with the stubbornness that defines his entire character, holds on. The shift between those 2 fights is the clearest evidence in the series that Mark is not just getting stronger, he is getting wiser. He is learning how to fight not just harder, but differently, and that capacity for adaptation, more than any raw power increase, is what eventually makes him capable of defeating Thrag. The other thing about Conquest that fans tend to overlook is what he represents about the Empire itself. Conquest is not an aberration. He is the logical endpoint of Viltrumite philosophy. If you build a culture that values strength and violence above everything else, Conquest is what you produce. A being of immense power who has no purpose beyond destruction. No family, no community, no art, no love, just the next planet to break. The Empire made Conquest, and Conquest is exactly what the Empire deserves. He is its reflection, its truest expression, and the fact that someone like Mark can beat someone like Conquest, not through superior power, but through superior willpower, tells you everything about what Kirkman thinks power should actually be for. And now, the hybrids. We discussed Oliver at the beginning, but the story of Viltrumite hybrids extends far beyond one half Thraxan boy, because after Thrag is exiled from the Empire, stripped of his rank and cast into the void, he does something that demonstrates exactly how terrifying his mind is, even without the physical power to back it up in the moment. This is where you see the full depth of Thrag's strategic mind, the quality that makes him more than just the strongest body in the room. Most Viltrumites who are exiled would rage. They would attack immediately, throw their power at the problem, try to reclaim what they lost through direct force. And Thrag could do that. He has the raw strength to cause enormous damage even as a lone combatant. But that is not what he does. Instead, he retreats. He disappears. For 5 years, he vanishes from the galactic stage entirely, and the other Viltrumites begin to wonder if he is dead. That patience is the most terrifying thing about Thrag. Not the punches, the patience. The willingness to spend 5 years in silence, building, preparing, waiting for the exact right moment to strike. Because Thrag understands something that most powerful beings never grasp. Immediate gratification is the enemy of lasting victory. The punch that feels good today might cost you the war tomorrow. And Thrag would rather win the war. He goes to Thraxa, the same planet where Nolan fathered Oliver, the planet of short-lived insectoid beings. And with methodical clinical precision, Thrag begins to breed an army. He impregnates hundreds of Thraxan women. Because Viltrumite DNA is dominant, the resulting children are more Viltrumite than Thraxan. They inherit the powers, the strength, the flight, the durability. And because of their Thraxan genetics, they age rapidly, reaching physical maturity in a fraction of the time a pure-blooded Viltrumite would need. Within 5 years, Thrag has hundreds of teenage Viltrumite hybrids at his disposal, each one powerful enough to threaten a planet, each one raised from birth to serve their father's vision. This is Thrag's genius and his horror distilled into a single strategy. He takes the one advantage the Thraxans possess, their rapid development cycle, and weaponizes it. He turns a peaceful planet into a breeding facility for soldiers. And the children who result are not people to him. They are inventory. Among them, Ursal and Onnen emerge as the most notable, the first Viltrumite twins born since the Scourge virus, a fact that gives them symbolic importance to Thrag and perhaps a trace of something almost like paternal regard, though with Thrag, it is always dangerous to assume that anything resembling emotion is genuine. Ursal in particular grows into a figure of real significance in the later comics. She is stronger and smarter than most of her siblings, more capable of independent thought, more willing to question. And it is that capacity for questioning that eventually saves countless lives. Because Ursal figures out the truth that her father would never speak aloud. He does not care about his children. They are not family to him. They are inventory, ammunition, bodies to be thrown at his enemies until the supply runs out. In the final battle, Thrag hurls his own offspring at Mark like projectiles, uses their bodies as missiles, throwing them with enough force to kill them on impact. That is what his children are to him, disposable. And Ursal, seeing this, turns. She convinces her surviving siblings to surrender. She betrays the most powerful Viltrumite in history, her own father, not because she lacks loyalty, but because she has seen the full truth of what loyalty to Thrag actually means. It means being thrown at an enemy until you splatter, and she chooses something better. After the war, Thrag's children join the surviving Viltrumites in building a new future. They become allies, community members. They leave Earth alongside Mark and help rebuild something that their father tried to destroy. The offspring of the greatest monster in the series become the seeds of something genuinely hopeful. That transformation from weapon to person, from ammunition to citizen, is one of the most quietly powerful arcs in the entire comic. It proves that Viltrumite nature is not destiny, that even beings who are literally bred for war can choose peace, if someone shows them that peace is an option. The story of Thrag's hybrid children also forces a reckoning with the pureblood ideology that shaped the Empire for millennia. Thrag himself proposed the interbreeding strategy. The same Thrag who represents the pinnacle of Viltrumite genetic engineering, the culmination of the Empire's obsession with purity, is the one who ultimately advocates for hybridization. Not because he has changed his beliefs, not because he has come to value other species, but because he understands the math. Fewer than 50 Viltrumites remain. The species cannot sustain itself through pure breeding alone. The numbers simply do not work. And so Thrag, the ultimate purist, the engineered apex of a culture that defined itself through genetic supremacy, becomes the architect of the very thing his culture spent millennia trying to prevent. He does it not out of philosophical evolution, but out of pragmatic necessity. And that distinction matters. Thrag does not believe hybrids are equal to pure Viltrumites. He believes they are useful tools, means to an end. And the end is the restoration of a pure Viltrumite order, built on the backs of half-breeds who will never be fully accepted by the culture they were bred to serve. That contradiction, that willingness to use the thing you despise because you cannot survive without it, is the most honest portrait of collapsing supremacist ideology that you will find in any comic book. Kirkman does not let the Viltrumites retreat gracefully from their beliefs. He makes them choke on them. In terms of raw power, most of Thrag's hybrid children sit in the mid-tier. Individually, they are comparable to standard Viltrumite soldiers. Collectively, as an army, they are a devastating force. but they lack the age and the accumulated power of the older Viltrumites. Ursal is probably the strongest among them, but even she would not survive a direct fight with someone like Anissa or Craig. The hybrids are dangerous because of their numbers, not because any single one of them represents a top-tier threat. And that fact, that they are strong because they are many rather than because they are individually supreme, is a direct contradiction of everything the Viltrumite Empire believed. The Empire valued individual strength above all. Thrag's army wins through collective force. Even in building his new empire, Thrag accidentally disproves the philosophy that made the old one. Before we reach the absolute pinnacle, there is one more figure who deserves acknowledgement. Not a Viltrumite, something else entirely. Battle Beast, the warrior whose real name in the comics is Thok, though few ever use it. He is from a planet where combat determines social status, where the strongest rule and the weakest serve. And Battle Beast rose to the absolute top of that hierarchy before abandoning his homeworld entirely because no one there could challenge him anymore. He left because victory had become boring. Let that settle in your mind. A being so powerful that he conquered everything his world had to offer and then left, not out of ambition but out of boredom, wandering the galaxy in search of someone, anyone, who could give him the fight he craved. Battle Beast is relevant to the Viltrumite ranking because he exists outside their hierarchy and yet intersects with it at its highest levels. When he first appears in the comics and fights Mark, the result is total devastation. Mark is dismantled. Not in a close fight, not in a battle where Mark almost pulls it off. Battle Beast takes Mark apart with methodical, overwhelming force, and the injuries Mark sustains are among the worst in the entire series. Battle Beast then walks away uninterested because Mark was not the challenge he was looking for. That casual dismissal is significant. It tells you that Battle Beast's power floor is above Mark's power ceiling at that point in the story. A non-Viltrumite, stronger than a half-Viltrumite who is already capable of punching people into orbit. The galaxy is larger and more dangerous than the Empire ever wanted to admit. Later, during the Viltrumite War, Battle Beast fights alongside the Coalition and engages multiple Viltrumites. He is one of the few non-Viltrumite beings who can trade blows with them at the upper tiers and survive. He is not stronger than Conquest, he is not stronger than Nolan, but he is close enough that the difference becomes academic in the chaos of a battlefield. And when he finally meets Thrag, when the two apex predators of their respective evolutionary lines find each other across the blood-soaked landscape of the Viltrumite War's aftermath, the result is the single longest and most savage fight in the entire comic. Battle Beast is not ranked among the Viltrumites because he is not one, but any honest ranking of Viltrumite power has to acknowledge the being who came closest to matching them from the outside, because Battle Beast proves that Viltrumite supremacy is not absolute. It is not a cosmic law. It is a statistical advantage that holds in most cases but breaks down at the extreme end of the power spectrum, where individual variation matters more than species-level averages. Battle Beast is the exception that proves the rule, and his fight with Thrag is the moment where the rule and the exception collide. And now, at last, the top, Thrag, Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire, the most powerful Viltrumite who ever lived, the engineered pinnacle. The final boss, Thrag was not born the way other Viltrumites were born. He was designed after the Great Purge, after the chaos and slaughter that followed Arbel's assassination. The surviving Viltrumite power structure recognized that they needed a leader who was beyond challenge, someone so overwhelmingly powerful that no other member of the species would ever consider rebellion. And so they did what Viltrumites do. They applied their philosophy of strength to the problem of leadership. They selected the strongest possible genetics. They subjected their candidate to the most rigorous combat training their civilization could devise. They sculpted every aspect of his development toward a single goal, creating the supreme warrior, the unchallengeable ruler, the apex. They succeeded beyond their wildest projections. And in doing so, they created a problem that would haunt the species for the rest of its existence. Because a leader who cannot be challenged is also a leader who cannot be corrected. A ruler who is stronger than everyone else does not need to listen, does not need to consider other perspectives, does not need to change. Thrag's power is not just his strength, it is his immunity to accountability. And a being who has never been held accountable for anything, who has spent his entire life as the undisputed apex of his species, develops a psychology that is not just confident, it is pathological. Thrag genuinely cannot conceive of a universe in which he is not supreme. That blind spot is both his greatest asset and, eventually, his fatal flaw. Thrag's power is not ambiguous. The comics do not leave room for debate or speculation. He is the strongest Viltrumite. Period. The other characters know it. The narrative confirms it. Every fight he enters demonstrates it with brutal clarity. The gap between Thrag and the second strongest Viltrumite is not a percentage point, it is a category. He does not just win his fights, he redefines what winning looks like. During the assault on Viltrum at the climax of the Viltrumite War, Thrag puts on a display that establishes his tier beyond any possible dispute. He punches Space Racer away like he is clearing a cobweb. He one-punches Oliver hard enough to rip the boy's jaw and arm from his body. He swats Mark and Nolan aside simultaneously, sending two of the most powerful Viltrumites in history tumbling through space as if they are not worth his full attention. And when his planet dies, when Viltrum crumbles around him, Thrag does not grieve. He rages, and in his rage he kills Thetis with a single decapitating strike, then turns on Mark and nearly crushes his skull between his fists. That is Thrag when he is angry. Imagine what he is like when he is patient. The fight with Battle Beast is the clearest extended demonstration of Thrag's power in the entire series. Battle Beast is widely considered one of the 2 or 3 most powerful warriors in the Invincible universe who is not a Viltrumite. He is a being who exists solely for combat, who defeated Mark Grayson without breaking a sweat, who has never encountered an opponent capable of truly testing him. Until Thrag, their battle begins in issue 115 and does not conclude until issue 120. 5 full issues of the comic. 5 issues of continuous, city-destroying, day-long combat across an entire planet. Both fighters sustain injuries that would be instantly fatal to virtually any other being in the universe. At one point, a Ragnar creature disembowels Thrag during the fight, and Battle Beast, in an act of warrior honor so extreme it borders on insanity, slices open his own abdomen to eliminate the unfair advantage. These two beings fight for days with their guts hanging out, because neither one will accept a victory that was not earned on equal terms. That level of commitment to combat, that absolute refusal to take any edge that was not won through skill and endurance alone, tells you something profound about what combat means at this level of power. It is not just fighting, it is ritual, it is religion. It is the only language that beings of this magnitude truly speak. The Thrag vs. Battle Beast fight is often cited by fans as the single best fight in the entire Invincible comic. And it is easy to understand why. It is not just the scale of the violence, though the scale is staggering. It is the mutual respect between the two combatants. These are beings who have never met their equal. Battle Beast has traveled the galaxy searching for someone who can truly test him. Thrag has never encountered anyone who can push him to his absolute limit. And when they find each other, there is a recognition that transcends language or culture or species. They are the same. They are both beings who define themselves entirely through combat, who have no purpose beyond the fight, who measure their worth by the caliber of the opponent standing across from them. And for the first time in either of their lives, the opponent is worthy. That mutual recognition is what makes Battle Beast's final words so powerful. He does not curse Thrag. He does not rage against his death. He thanks him, because Thrag gave Battle Beast the one thing he wanted more than anything else in the universe: a death that mattered, a fight that was real, an opponent who could actually kill him. In a life spent searching for that moment, Battle Beast found it in Thrag, and he dies grateful. Thrag, characteristically, shows no such sentiment. He takes Battle Beast's hide, has it fashioned into a cape, and wears it. For Thrag, the fight was not a moment of connection or recognition. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept. He is the strongest, and now everyone who looks at his cape knows it. That difference in how they process the same fight tells you everything about the gap between Thrag and everyone else. Not a gap in power, though that exists too. A gap in humanity. Battle Beast, for all his violence, has a soul. Thrag is a machine that looks like a person. And after all of that, after the longest and most savage fight in the series, Thrag reaches into Battle Beast's chest and rips out his heart, crushes it, kills the unkillable. And Battle Beast, dying, thanks him. Thanks the being who is killing him for providing the warrior's death he spent his entire life seeking, the only opponent who was worthy of ending him. Thrag takes Battle Beast's hide, has it made into a cape, and wears the skin of the unkillable as a trophy for the rest of the series. That cape is not decoration. It is a statement, a warning. It says, "The strongest non-Viltrumite warrior in the galaxy is a piece of clothing on my shoulders. Whatever you think you are, whatever you think you can do, look at my cape and understand where you stand." He kills Omni-Man by ripping out his heart. He kills Oliver by driving his hand through his chest. He kills Thetis by removing his head. He kills Battle Beast by crushing his heart. 4 of the most significant deaths in the entire series. All Thrag. No other character in the comic has a kill list that even approaches this. He has ended more powerful beings than most civilizations have produced. But Thrag is not just a brute. He is dangerously intelligent. After his exile, rather than attacking immediately, he retreats to Thraxa and spends 5 years building an army of hybrid children. He trains them, organizes them, prepares a military campaign. That level of patience, that willingness to invest years of effort before striking, is what makes Thrag a true final boss, rather than just a strong opponent. He can beat you in a straight fight, and he can also outthink you over a decade-long strategic horizon. Most great villains in fiction are one or the other, physically dominant or strategically brilliant. Thrag is both, and the combination makes him one of the most compelling antagonists in the history of the superhero genre. Thrag's leadership philosophy is itself a form of violence. It is not governance in any recognizable sense. It is domination formalized into a system. Under Thrag, the Viltrumite Empire operates on a single principle. The strongest decides, and everyone else obeys. There is no council. There is no debate. There is no mechanism for dissent that does not involve challenging Thrag to physical combat. And since no one can beat him in physical combat, there is no mechanism for dissent at all. This creates a paradox that Thrag himself never recognizes. He believes he is preserving the Empire. He believes he is the guardian of Viltrumite strength, the steward of their future. But what he has actually created is a system with a single point of failure: himself. If Thrag falls, the Empire has no succession plan, no institutional knowledge that is not filtered through his singular perspective, no leadership structure capable of functioning without him. He has made himself indispensable, and indispensability is just another word for fragility. A leader who cannot be replaced is a leader whose death is an extinction event for the system he built. And that is exactly what happens. When Thrag dies in the sun, the empire he rebuilt dies with him. Not because the other Viltrumites are incapable of leading, but because Thrag's leadership model left no room for anyone else to develop leadership capacity. He did not delegate authority, he concentrated it. And concentration without succession is a recipe for collapse. He is also the keeper of the Empire's greatest secret. Thrag discovered that Nolan Grayson descends from Emperor Argal's bloodline. This means Nolan is the legitimate heir to the Viltrumite throne. And Thrag, rather than revealing this information and relinquishing power, buries it. He conceals the truth for centuries, maintains his position through deception because the alternative, ceding power to anyone, is inconceivable to him. Thrag's identity is built on supremacy. Take that away, and there is nothing left. He is the throne. Without it, he is just a very strong man with no purpose. And so, he lies. For centuries, to every member of his species. Because the truth would unmake him. In the animated series, Thrag was introduced in Season 4, voiced by Lee Pace. The casting captures something essential about the character. Thrag does not yell. He does not rant. He speaks with the quiet certainty of someone who has never encountered a situation he could not control. It is not arrogance in the theatrical sense. It is the settled confidence of a being who knows with absolute empirical certainty that he is the most dangerous entity in any room he enters. And Lee Pace delivers that with a restraint that makes the character even more frightening. You keep waiting for Thrag to raise his voice, and he never does, because he does not need to. Only Mark Grayson kills Thrag, and he does it by dragging the Grand Regent into a star. Not by overpowering him, not by outfighting him, by choosing a battlefield where physical supremacy is secondary to the ability to survive in an environment that is trying to kill both of you. Inside the sun, both fighters burn. Both fighters are stripped down to barely recognizable husks of flesh and bone. And even there, even dying, even melting, Thrag breaks Mark's arms and keeps fighting. Because Thrag does not stop. Ever. For any reason. Until his heart stops beating or his brain stops functioning, Thrag fights. And Mark, with both arms broken, with no skin, with nothing left but the teeth in his skull and the will in his soul, rips out Thrag's throat. And the Grand Regent dies inside a star, consumed by the same kind of overwhelming force that he spent his entire life embodying. Think about the symmetry of that death for a moment. Thrag was built to be the sun of the Viltrumite Empire, the center around which everything orbits, the source of power that holds the system together, and he dies inside an actual sun. The metaphor becomes literal. The being who could not tolerate anything brighter than himself is consumed by something so much larger, so much more powerful, that his individual strength becomes meaningless. Inside a star, it does not matter how strong you are. The star does not care. It does not recognize hierarchies or rankings or engineered genetics. It just burns. And Thrag, who spent his entire existence ensuring that the universe acknowledged his supremacy, dies in the one place where supremacy has no meaning, where the scale is so vast that even the strongest Viltrumite in history is just fuel. That is the final irony of Thrag's life. He spent millennia making the universe small enough for him to dominate, and he dies in the one place where the universe reminds him how small he actually is. There is a particular tragedy to Thrag's end that is easy to miss beneath all the violence. He was made for this. Every choice was taken from him before he could make it. His genetics were chosen. His training was mandated. His role was assigned. Thrag never had the option of being anything other than the supreme warrior. He never had the chance to develop compassion or curiosity or tenderness, because those qualities were bred out of him before he was born. In a sense, Thrag is as much a victim of the Viltrumite Empire as anyone the Empire ever conquered. He is the Empire's perfect product, and like all perfect products, he was designed for a purpose that ultimately destroys him. Nolan chose a different path and found redemption. Mark was raised with human values and became something new. Even Craig and Anissa managed to change when given the chance. But Thrag was never given a chance. He was built to be the top of the ranking, and the ranking was all he ever had. When you strip everything away, when you look past the feats and the kills and the terror, Thrag is a being who was never allowed to be anything other than powerful. And that, in the end, is the most Viltrumite story of all. That is the ranking, from bottom to top. Oliver Grayson, the half-Thraxan hybrid who sat at the bottom of the power scale and the top of the courage scale, who died not because he could win, but because he could love. Lucan, Thula, and Vidor, the soldiers who showed you what average Viltrumite power looks like. Average, and yet strong enough to beat one of the galaxy's elite fighters 3-on-1 without breaking a sweat. Anissa, the speed demon, the solo operative, the warrior who spent her life following orders and died breaking them to protect someone she once tried to destroy. General Craig, the strategist, the second in command, strong enough to survive anything, never quite strong enough to win the fights that define legacies. Thetis, the ancient rebel, the founder of the Coalition, the mind that created the Scourge virus and nearly erased his own species from existence. Proof that intelligence, given enough time and motivation, can be more dangerous than any amount of muscle. Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, the father, the killer, the redeemed, planet-level power, millennia of experience, and two words that carry more weight than all his feats combined. Be better. Mark Grayson, invincible, the half-human who started at the bottom and ended at the top. Not because he was the strongest, because he was the most stubborn, because he took every beating the universe could throw at him and refused, absolutely refused, to accept that any of them were the last one. Conquest, the joyful destroyer, the being who lived for violence and died wrapped in it, second only to one and terrifying enough to make you forget that anyone else exists. And Thrag, Grand Regent, engineered god, the most powerful Viltrumite in history who had to be drowned in a star because nothing else in the universe could end him, who died wearing the skin of the unkillable, and still almost won. But the ranking is only part of the story. Because the Viltrumites as a species are not just a collection of power levels arranged from lowest to highest, they are a parable, a species that defined itself by strength, that purged its own weak, that conquered the galaxy because it could, and that ended up with fewer than 50 survivors because a society built on nothing but power eventually has no defense against the one thing power cannot solve. The Scourge virus did not outsmart the Viltrumites through superior strategy. It killed them because a species that eliminates genetic diversity in pursuit of purity has no immune defense against a targeted pathogen. The Great Purge did not make them invincible. It made them brittle. Every weak member they killed was a unique genome they would never get back. And by the time the species realized this, it was too late to fix through anything other than the very integration and hybridization they had always despised. In the end, the Viltrumites survive, not through conquest, not through purity, through mixing with other species, through the hybrids they once would have considered inferior, through Oliver, through Ursal and her siblings. The most powerful species in the universe is saved by the thing it tried hardest to eliminate: diversity, compassion, the willingness to change. There is a conversation that fans of the series have been having since the beginning, and it is a conversation that gets more interesting the deeper you go. The conversation is about what makes Invincible different from other superhero stories, and the answer, at least from the perspective of this ranking, is that Invincible takes power seriously. Most superhero stories treat power as a given. The hero is strong, the villain is strong, they fight, someone wins. Power is a tool, a means to an end. But Invincible treats power as a subject of inquiry. It asks what happens to a species that organizes itself entirely around power. It asks what happens to a father who has more power than his son and has to decide whether to use it. It asks what happens to a boy who inherits power from a monster and has to figure out whether that inheritance defines him. Every Viltrumite on this list is an answer to one of those questions. Oliver answers the question of what happens when power is not enough. Thrag answers the question of what happens when power is all you have. Nolan answers the question of what happens when power meets love and has to choose between them. And Mark answers the question of whether power can be redeemed, whether the same abilities that were used to conquer and destroy can be redirected towards something better. The entire series is a meditation on that question. And the fact that Mark ends up using his Viltrumite power to lead a peaceful rebuilding rather than a new empire is the most radical statement Kirkman makes. Robert Kirkman created the Invincible comic in 2003. Over the next 15 years, across 144 issues, he built one of the most complex, emotionally devastating, and philosophically rich superhero stories ever told. The animated series, now 4 seasons deep from 2021 through 2026, with a 5th already announced, has brought that story to an audience larger than the comics could ever have reached. And the Viltrumites remain at the heart of it, the mirror that Kirkman holds up to every empire that ever existed, every civilization that confused strength for virtue, every culture that purged its own in the name of purity and called the result progress. So if you are still here, drifting between awake and sleep, let this be the thought you carry into the dark. The strongest being in the Invincible universe is not the one who was built for it. It is not Thrag. Thrag is dead, consumed by the sun, his body ash, his legacy in ruins. The strongest being is the half-human kid from suburban Earth who got his powers at 17 and spent the next 15 years of publication getting beaten down, broken apart, hospitalized, disemboweled, burned alive, and told he was not enough. And every single time, he got back up. Not because he was the strongest, because he was the most willing to keep going. That is the real ranking. Not power levels, not feats, not who punches harder or flies faster or lives longer. The real ranking is who gets back up. And nobody in 144 issues of comic book storytelling gets back up more times than Mark Grayson. That is it for tonight. If you enjoyed this, subscribing really does help us keep making these long deep dives. It is free, it takes a second, and it means more than you know. Rest well, and remember, be better.